Well, welcome. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Wednesday. It's April 20th, and we're extremely excited today for our webinar. Last month, not sure if any of you attended, but we did a session on ransomware and how to prepare yourself for those types of threats. Today, we're gonna switch it up a little bit. We're gonna have more of an open session, less slides, which I love. That's a great thing. And we're gonna kind of talk about where we are today with the threat landscape and how we think you should be prepared to help your customers. So this is going to be an open discussion between our two guests. And before I announce them and go into some surveys here, just want to say we're actually not going to talk about products, but just in case, any information we talk about, any future or features or functionality, should not be interpreted as a commitment from Enable. So just wanted to kind of get that out there, but we're really not going to talk about product today. Today's not product. So we're super excited to have our first guest here. Really don't need much of an introduction. I think many of you know Chris Krebs, former U.S. Director, CISA of the Homeland Security. Many, if you haven't YouTubed him, Googling, he's got many sessions on YouTube, and has worked with our company over the years, and also a new advocate for an advisory board for SentinelOne, if you didn't know that as well. And then we had our host today is our very own Dave MacKinnon. He's our Vice President and CSO. Not sure if you've seen him on any webinars as well, but really a great guy. Has really turned our business around over the last couple of years. As you all know, we've spun out of SolarWinds and really redeveloped our security infrastructure here at Enable. So we're really excited. We're going to start first. Well, let me back up. Sorry, everyone is on hold. If you look at your menu options on the right, you have polls, questions, and chat. Right, we're going to do some polls here. We're going to do 2 polls. If you have any questions, please use the questions drop down. Do not use the chat. We will not get to all the questions today. If you put them in the questions, then we can download those and respond back to you. So please do not use the chat. So let's start with our first poll. So we're going to give this a couple of minutes. We're about 28% people voted. We're about 40% people voted. Going really fast. This is awesome. We all have experienced cybersecurity attacks this year. So we really just wanted to get a sense here really briefly. All right, we're about 75%, looking good. Thank you. And the results. So about 74% of us have said, yes, we have experienced some sort of cyber threat this year. Awesome. Thank you for those. Next one. So are you increasing your spend? So this is really important for us to understand, right? Hopefully we did a survey. If you haven't seen our cybersecurity threat report on our website, please go there. This is a very important question. We asked about 500 of our customers, are you increasing your security spend? So we hope you are. Seeing some great numbers here, so thank you. Poll's almost closing. Awesome. So 87% of you are saying you are increasing your spend. Love to hear that. Love. That's a great thing. It's very important. So let's get started. No more of the marketing guy here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to let Chris and Dave kind of just have this fireside chat, right? Dave's going to ask questions, and as they go on, please pop some questions in, right, into that drop down, and I'll moderate that throughout the session. But we may go 45 to an hour, so please stay with us throughout this exciting time. So Dave, I'm going to pass it over to you, and best of luck, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Chris, thank you for joining us today. I again, I know we talked earlier, your background really makes mine look pretty crappy, but fortunately, we did a little touch up before we started this today. So definitely appreciate you joining. I guess to jump right in, that stat we just talked about, 74% of those individuals are seeing an increase in cybersecurity attacks. How do you take, just the change in the landscape over the last, we can go really the last 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, if you want to look at more recent events, or what do you?
So I think in general, those statistics, the poll results are not surprising, and they really shouldn't be surprising to anyone. When you kind of step back and you look at our increasing dependencies on technology, whether it's at home, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the places we worship, wherever you want to talk about, there's this increased dependency on technologies. And the unfortunate thing is that it is also becoming a little bit more complicated to manage all the devices. There was just a great article yesterday about how IoT in particular is a bit of a fly-by-night space that overnight could become an organization could shut down the management console for devices that manage smart homes. So it's really a complicated space. The configuration and vulnerability issues alone are challenging. But to bring it in really tightly right now on this unique moment in history, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has, I think, really heightened the awareness of the fact that there are bad actors out there, that there are nation states out there that are extremely capable and use cyber attacks as a part of their broader national security and objectives. So when you think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's something that I think most, at least in Washington, D.C. and the intelligence community, the spies at the National Security Agency and the CIA and all those others had been warning about, not just like since last fall, but you got to keep in mind that this is a continuation of an invasion that began in 2014. That's when the Russians first moved into eastern Ukraine and then into Crimea, right there on the Black Sea. So as a part of that invasion into 8 years ago, the Russians used a range of different techniques. They used denial of service attacks. They used website defacements of government agency, of banks, of other critical organizations. And then over that time period from 14 to 22, it's almost like every year there was something new happening that the Russians had launched. In 2015, they brought down the grid in Ukraine. In 2016, they brought down the grid again in Ukraine. And in 2017, NotPetya, the destructive attack that kind of looked like ransomware, that cascaded across the globe. That was a 200 billion plus loss. I mean, a massive, massive event. And they didn't stop there. They've been testing other capabilities within Ukraine over the last several years. And so that brings us to January. And January 14th, there was a series of website defacements and other wiper attacks that launched in January, kind of about a month in advance of the attack. Fast forward a month. Again, website defacements, denial of service, and wiper attacks. And I think as you look back since really January, mid-January, there have been on the order now of 10 different wiper attacks. And all wiper attacks are, it's malware at the very end of an attack or a campaign that effectively detonates inside a network, that wipes out computers, that makes it impossible to manage whether the workstations for the employees or just the broader network control plane. And so we're talking like at this point about 10 of those unique independent, and whether they're Russian or from Belarus or elsewhere, it's still not clear, but it's coordinated with this Russian invasion. And that's just inside Ukraine. There have been some events that have cascaded outside. So there was one back in February, Hermetic Wiper, which pushed out through a group policy object. And so just from a policy alone, a target inside Ukraine that had connections out to some Baltic states of Lithuania and Latvia, they received the malware, the wiper as well. So it just shows that how critical it is to manage your geographic connections and really have good segmentation from country to country, or at least within regions, so look, there are bad people out there that are focused on disrupting actions in a country, and then you may be a collateral damage to those sorts of attacks. So again, that's Russia, that's Ukraine, and then there's the first ring out of those immediate areas around. And I think what the government here in the US is most worried about right now is that we're still 50 some odd 60 days into the invasion of Ukraine, and what we're seeing is an increase of lethal aid support. So you keep hearing about missiles and anti-tanks rounds, you hear about guns and drones and all these things. We are equipping the Ukrainians to fight the Russians, to kill Russians, and that is going to put political pressure in the Kremlin so that they strike back, not just at Ukraine, but also at Western governments that are supporting Ukraine. And so this is where cyber comes in, and this is what the government's really concerned about. They're worried that whether it's lethal aid or continued sanctions on Russia, the U.S. government and allies in UK and elsewhere, the United Kingdom and elsewhere, are worried that where the Russians have been actually fairly disciplined in hitting third-party countries, that those governors, those checks, those controls may come off, and you may start seeing hits against oil and natural gas, against the water supply, against the grid, against banks, against transportation. And so when you think back to a couple of weeks ago when President Biden went to the podium and said, hey, there's evolving intelligence, everybody needs to be prepared. You really need to take that to heart, because I can't remember in my service when a president went with such a kind of alarm, an alert with such urgency, with an emphatic really an emphasis on intelligence and how the intelligence is pointing one way. So that's where you really should be paying attention and understand that whether we like it or not, there's a conflict that is happening inside Ukraine that has all the potential in the world to spill out and hit us here at home. And that's when things, I think, for us, the dynamics truly change.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely, as I've watched it kind of from my seat, watching the risk. I mean, you talk about critical infrastructure being targeted, but what's the spillover into the rest of us? I mean, for our partners and their customers, that's the MSP base. What are some things that, from an incident response perspective, I'm sure you did a lot of incident response planning and prepping, at the national level. What are some lessons that you took at the national level that businesses could take, especially in this very unique time of war going on in Eastern Europe?
So, yeah, I think the unfortunate answer is that we all have far too much experience, more experience than any of us would really like in incident response. And the real challenge is, unfortunately, we don't know at the national level or in any sort of aggregated sense how many cyber events there are on a daily basis. And the reason for that is, at least up until recently, and even that's not enforced from a legislative perspective, there is no central aggregator. There's no requirement for organizations to notify into a central repository that, hey, we got hit by a ransomware attack, we got hit by a business email compromise, we got hit by a nation state. There's no requirement. And so the government is, to a certain extent, having to cobble together intelligence reports, hits on government agencies, state or local, so that it's really becoming a hodgepodge and then a bit of a, we think there's this much sort of activity out there. But over the last several years, ransomware for sure has been one of the most significant and impactful types of cyber activity we've seen. Cybercrime in general is just off the charts. And it makes perfect sense, honestly, when you step back and think about how really all ransomware is don't laugh when I say this, it's good business for the bad guys. It's what they've done is they've identified a way to monetize network misconfigurations, network vulnerabilities, and really stupid human tricks, right? I mean, it's people handing out passwords and things like that. They figured out how to extract money and value out of a massive total addressable market. So they really are rational economic thinkers, which works to our advantage. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But again, what they've done is they've identified that we have significant vulnerabilities and misconfigurations throughout our networks. They figured out a way to monetize that, and that's principally through cryptocurrencies and the fact that up to recently, at least, cryptocurrency, that entire economy has existed in a space that that lives outside the regulatory enforcement mechanisms of the fiat economy. So our banking institutions that really have a significant amount of scrutiny from federal and state treasury, and other regulators. Crypto wallets don't have that. I mean, I don't know if any of y'all if anybody trades in cryptocurrency or NFTs or anything like that and just try to do your federal taxes the other day. I read a lot of that on Twitter over the last few days about how people are like, I guess I'm going to jail. It's just too hard to do all this. It really is complicated for the regulators to get a good understanding. But again, the bad guys have exploited that, and so they've monetized it. And then the third piece is that they've operated out of a space that has been welcoming to that sort of criminal enterprise and criminal activity. And I'm specifically talking about Russia. Again, things kind of lead back to Russia every now and then. So it's those ransomware actors that can operate out of Russia and Eastern Europe and don't have any sort of central federal oversight or saying you can't do that. As long as, and this is a little anecdote, as long as you don't hit Russian targets. And there, when you read some of the forensic reports of the malware that these bad guys use, the ransomware actors use, one of the first things they do is check to see if the Russian language or a Cyrillic language pack is installed on the machine. And if they see it, they exit the process. They're like, this target's off limits. And that's kind of one of those spoken or unspoken rules of the road for cyber criminals that operate in Eastern Europe. You don't attack the motherland. And I think up to now, again, up to about now, that is held true. But you're seeing, I think, a little bit of divergence, again, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All right, so incident response. I think the things that we've seen over the last several years, starting at the back, is that you have to have starting at the top rather, you have to have a leadership team that understands that cyber attacks are not just technical risks. It's not just about maybe losing a little bit of money. It's truly a business disruption risk. If you think about the Colonial Pipeline attack, I know, Dave, you mentioned, I think that you're down in Atlanta, I'm up in Washington, D.C. We both probably experienced the Colonial Pipeline attack last year. That was a business disruption attack, even though it hit the IT side and not the operational technology side. They had to shut down the process of the pipeline because it became a safety issue and they were not able to really understand where product was shipping and how it was moving throughout the pipeline. But nonetheless, about 4 days up here in DC, I wasn't able to get gas for my car. Dave, I'm sure you had the same experience.
Same problem. Yep.
And so you have to start with that leadership understanding that this is truly a business risk, that it could be existential in some situations. The second is everybody is a part of the team. Everybody from that CEO all the way down to an intern or a field rep or an executive assistant or a receptionist. And that's what the bad guys are kind of optimizing for. They're optimizing to find that person that's somewhere on the edge of the organization that might be susceptible to a phishing attack and turn over credentials if you're not in a really hardened environment with multi-factor and hardware tokens and things like that. But they are looking for that one person that they can get that'll allow them to move in and then take advantage of an environment that hasn't been really segmented off to prevent east-west movement. They're also looking for an open port. So look, COVID changed a lot about how organizations operate. You go almost overnight from a bricks and mortar, everybody in the office 5 days a week, to for a number of months, a lot of people had to go home and work from home. And then that allowed for, how do you operate in an office environment? Well, you're going to use remote desktop protocols. You're going to use remote access technologies and capabilities. The bad guys can use those too, because again, you're using a username and password a lot of times to get through those remote access. And so the bad guys are targeting those and looking for some of those management consoles that have default passwords, and they'll brute force the heck out of them. So you really have to understand in your environment how what are the doors that are open, what are the ports that are open, and minimize them to the greatest extent possible. And if you've got some sort of remote access capability, you have to really harden that and monitor it relentlessly. Okay, other issues that you really have to think about from preparing for an event is attack surface management. We already talked about remote ports and things like that, but it's keeping your systems as up to date as possible. If you have the budget for it, and it was great to see those statistics about improving security budgets, keep in mind that the security budget rides or dies with the CIO shop as well. And so you want to continue to improve and move to those modern systems. And to the extent possible, you don't want Windows XP or Windows Vista or anything like that in your space. You want to be on the most modern systems and really manage your identity piece and ensuring that you're just using some really basic, just like cyber hygiene concepts of good management of systems. Same thing goes for identity management, just good hygiene and upkeep. Make sure that the HR team is really tied in closely with your security operations, because what happens when you exit an employee or they move on, they go back to school or they move somewhere else, you want to make sure that you understand what access they had and that turns off. Same thing goes for employees that are moving around within your company. If you have one move from one division to another where they may have had access within the chief financial officer shop and access to some of the financial books, and they're moving over to somewhere else, make sure that you're cleaning, you're pruning, just like you're doing some good yard work there to make sure that you're trimming back any of the unnecessary access. Incident response plans, you've got to have an incident response plan for your organization that's up to date so that everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are when a bad day happens. But and by the way, bad days happen to everyone, and there's no shame whatsoever in having an event. What I think truly differentiates companies and organizations that are capable and mature is how they react in the moment and how they can minimize the damage and shut down the blast radius as much as possible. One of the really effective tools for ensuring that you're ready for an event or an incident is a tabletop exercise for your leadership team, and that the CEO is involved. And it's not just on the chief information security officer to be a hero and shoulder the whole organization through this. It is really about the CEO, the COO, that whoever owns the company, whoever's involved in the day-to-day management, that you are a part of the response, that you know how you're communicating to your employees, you know how you're communicating to your customers, and depending on who you are and how important you are as a company, frankly, how you're communicating to the general public. If you provide a service that's pretty critical to an essential service within a community, you want to make sure that you're being as transparent as possible with stakeholders in general, and that you're not hiding anything or just hoping it goes away. I've seen more organizations fail in this space because they just thought it would all blow over, and it eventually comes out. You can't keep secrets as soon as you have 3 people involved in in any sort of event. And then the last piece here is all about recovery. Again, there's no shaming in having an event. Again, what separates the successful companies that can manage and work through an event is how you get back to good. And so it's all about those backups that are offline, they're immutable, that you can restore. So if you are working with an MSP or you have your an outside vendor that's managing your backup and recovery systems, make sure you test them. I've seen more times than I care to remember how a recovery process fails when you try to rebuild, which is also related to ransomware actors. If you think you're going to be able to rebuild and restore just by paying them and they'll give them the key, remember they're economic rational actors, just like you and I are. They don't invest on the back end. They don't invest on the recovery. They invest on the lockup and the exploit. So I've seen, again, far too many times where the unlock key, the decryptor key, just doesn't work all that great. And it's actually probably more effective for you to build up from the base.
Yeah. One point I'd like to add, especially because it's something we get internally, is you can't recover everything at the same time. That's a lot of the questions we have. Like, what part of that incident response and disaster recovery planning is having that. What do we need first? What's the most important application to get our business back online? Because
right.
You've been through incidents, I've been through incidents. I use the analogy from Mike Tyson: everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, and the incident is when you get punched in the face, and everybody's like, I don't know what to do. And having those plans, I 100% agree with Ted. We actually have a tabletop here this afternoon, so I'm very excited about it. Nobody else is, but they think I'm a glutton.
Yeah, so that's a great point that I don't think I emphasize enough today or really any time. But to your point, you really have, from a business continuity perspective, you have to know those critical functions throughout your organization. You have to be able to make the decision where you're going to place your scarce resources at the beginning of the event. What can you not lose? What has to come back up first? And what are the things that you're not like, you know what, we may have to put that down to the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th priority level or whatever. Focus, make sure you know what you have to have up and running, and really, make sure you know what's existential for the organization.
Yeah, and to your point, testing it too. Like, it's great to say we need to have this back in an hour, but if it's going to take you 5 hours to recover it, well, guess what? You just blew your SLA out of the water, and your business is crippled. How do we accelerate that?
And on that note, this is where, one of the things that I really was always trying to focus on when in government was helping the team, helping the organization to the greatest extent possible, manage almost 2 different time scales in your head. And that really materialized into a motto and almost kind of like a rallying cry for the organization. And it was known as defend today, secure tomorrow. And what that really means is that every day we wake up, we get in the office, we get online, and we know what we have to do that day. And unfortunately, we become overcome, we over-focus and over-prioritize on getting through today. But there's next week, there's next month. And so make sure that you're building into your regular management cadence and in your leadership cycles time to think about, okay, what's next, or what additionally do we have to do to put ourselves in a more secure position tomorrow. And so through your quarterly planning cycles, or through your half-year planning cycles, or really your annual planning cycles, make sure you set aside that time, that day or so, whatever it takes, to review and reflect on the last, whatever that time period is, to make sure that your incident management plans are up to date. And it's all just about workflows and good processes. But just, to your point, when you pull that incident response plan off, you're like, oh, the incident manager actually left 6 months ago. Who's running the show now? So it's really critical to have just a good cadence built in. So set that time aside. But to your point, make sure you set time aside to make sure that those backups work and that you can recover. And then again, exactly what that workflow looks like.
Yeah, I actually, so I'm actually putting on the tabletop today, so I get to sit out of it, which it'll be interesting because I don't get to quarterback it. So well, there's nobody on this. Hopefully that's going to be in the tabletop, but I'm curious to see how it plays out. Another question, I want to pivot back here.
I love tabletops and crisis simulations. They're a lot of fun, and actually, you kind of can sort out who needs to be on the team and who needs a little bit of additional help. But they're so valuable when you actually have an answer. You're like, you remember we were talking about this 2 months ago. This is where you need to go, and it also calms people down through I think particularly stressful decision points.
Yeah, and I think most people don't come into a tabletop. They all expect it to go perfect. Like, we have a plan, and the one thing I tell our teams before we start the tabletop is today will not be perfect. If we execute today flawlessly, we've lied to ourselves about what we're prepared to do. Like, the intent of the tabletop is to figure out what gaps we have in our processes, what gaps we have in our understanding, and really work together. So when the event happens, and I'm very much one of those, when it happens. So in that regard, for MSPs who haven't gone through those tabletop exercises before, do you have any like good pointers? Because it's, we have a huge security team here. Obviously, we have a large organization, but when you have smaller organizations, like any good pointers you can think of off top of mind to help them ease into that experience, because it's a very healthy experience to go through.
Yeah, this is where, again, partnering with a good MSP can help you understand some of the dependencies you have externally. And sometimes there are, sometimes an MSP will have a template for you for an incident response plan, or a template for you like a tabletop in the box. Also, I would look to federal government resources. What I was always trying to do with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency was provide as much of a bootstrapping experience as possible to the security have-nots. And it's an important delineation. So when you think about the big banks, there are big banks out there, some of the financial institutions that you see, commercials for when you watch the Masters or whatever, right? They have security budgets of close to $1 billion a year. It's insane how much they have. But they also have massive enterprises, massive networks that they have to manage. But that's just not the experience and the reality for really 95% of the rest of American businesses. And so there's a great area, I think, for the federal government, not just on the cyber side, but just on the business resilience side, which rolls in FEMA, by the way, because FEMA really is part of the hazard risk reduction. We typically just think about them after hurricanes and tornadoes, but they have a larger organizational resilience. And so CISA, working together with FEMA for years, has pulled together tabletop exercises in a box that you can that any organization can go get. It's got the checklist, it's got scenarios and injects that are based on a ransomware event that can put you in a simulation, give you a set of questions, really in a judgment-free zone that you can then work through. And it's like, hey, have we thought about this? Where are we on deploying multi-factor authentication? What sort of vulnerability management program do we have in place to ensure that we are patching for known exploited vulnerabilities? What is there's a great question in here about CISA. The CISA CEO recommends contacting the FBI. So look, you should always talk to, I think, law enforcement. You should talk to your lawyer first, right? You need to have your checklist of people that you reach out to and you call. And I always recommend having a legal counsel on your contact list in the wake of an event. And so make sure that in your exercises, make sure you have the people that you would call, at least from your first rung. Make sure that they're plugged in. But yes, law enforcement can be helpful, and the CISA as well. I would let them know as well that you're having an event and an incident, and there are resources from an incident response perspective that they may be able to provide as well. Yeah,
US CERT is always, from what I've heard, they're extremely helpful during incidents. Not that I've ever been through an incident.
So US CERT, which is part of CISA, yep, right? It's the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team. They have capabilities on information sharing, on good guidance and resources to prepare for an event and how you work through an event. But the one thing I would really stress here is that the US government is not equipped and is not situated to come in and manage your incident response for you, nor do you want them. They don't know your networks. They won't be able to come in immediately. So this is where you really need to think through who your partners are that understand who you are and what sort of requirements you're going to have in the middle of the event. Again, this is where a good MSP is a great partner, as well as that outside legal team. And then to the extent that you can have an incident response team on retainer or available to you for contact, And yes, there are the bigs, there's the CrowdStrikes and the Mandiants, but every state, every jurisdiction that I've seen across the country has locally available information security experts and third parties that are able to help.
Yeah, and I think the big point there is making sure you have them on retainer. Like the first time you're talking to them should not be the, hey, we're having this major event, how quickly can you parachute in? It's like even with our retainer, we meet with our IR retaining team every 6 months just to update our playbooks to make sure that they're up to speed on what we changed, so that they're not foreign to our environment when something happens. Now, I'm going to knock on some wood over here, hoping that we don't have to test that, but I think that's important too. Don't wait for the problem to happen. Make sure you have all those steps, the preparedness in place to avoid those problems and the delays too, because time is of the essence when you're going through an incident.
Yep.
So you had talked earlier, we briefly discussed it, but like reporting of incidents to at the government level, and I know there's some legislation going through right now about incident reporting.
Yep.
What's your take on that? Is that something that you think we need to expand? Is it something that that we should be talking more about? Because we talked the question in the beginning that 74% of those people saw an increase in cyber attacks, and I may argue personally, hey, I don't think the volume's gone up. Our awareness has expanded. I think the attacks have always been there, but people have more eyes on it. But what's your take on really getting that information out there so that the greater community could benefit from it?
Well, so Tony Stark here, and I almost want to say Iron Man. Tony Stark has asked a couple great questions, and one of them is, how would you know you're being attacked? We're being attacked all the time. Of course, at the perimeter and across with spam. So I think what the government really wants to know is when there is an event unfolding where there's potential loss of intellectual property, of PII, those are the sorts of events where there are actual crimes being committed within a network and exfiltration of data. Those are the sorts of things that the government wants to know. And in many cases, there are already requirements, at least for publicly traded companies under Sarbanes-Oxley. There are also individual requirements for financial institutions, but it's bigger than that as well, right? IT software, services, and products, if there's source code that's been accessed, those are the sorts of things the government wants to know as well, but so that they can ensure there has been an adequate investigation, that we know what the potential implications of that sort of event are. That's why it's important to work so closely with government. So again, stepping back on incident reporting, there was a law passed just a month or so ago, the cyber incident reporting requirement. It's going to require CISA to work with external partners to develop a regulatory regime over the course of the next 18 months that lays out who is subject to this law, and it's likely going to be the larger critical infrastructure. It's not going to be everyone, and I think that was a real big point of policy contention within the Congress, and Senator Scott from Florida in particular was very vocal about the fact that the reporting requirement cannot and should not include every single small business out there, every single mom and pop shop. They just don't have the resources, the awareness to be able to respond to this, particularly when you look at some of the penalties. But again, there's a scope. So who's it apply to? It's going to be critical infrastructure, defense industrial base, government contractors, IT services, energy. Again, the big critical infrastructure and essential service providers to the economy. The second is, what's the timeline? So they'll work through what is in scope of an event, and it's not clear to me exactly what that looks like just yet. And then there's going to be a timeline associated with that, and it could be 24 to 72 hours. I suspect it'll be a little bit longer because, I mean, Dave, when you actually have an event, is it 24 hours? Do you have enough to report to government within 24 hours? After 72 hours, after not a full investigation, but across 72 hours, you get a little bit more sense of what's going on, so you can provide some information to the government. That also gives you time to engage your third parties, to bring the legal team in, to bring some of the incident responders in so that they can develop meaningful understanding of what's happening and start to stop the event, to shut it down. And then the third is, what's the penalty if you do not report? So those are the three pieces I think that are still in play. And look, the punchline though is whether you're subject to the requirements or not, I think it's still important again that you do work with the federal government. You let them know, and there are two reasons for this. One is that they may be able to provide you a leg up. If you think about some of the events last year, the FBI was able to reclaim money from a ransomware payment. Not sure that was the right public policy, at least to make it known publicly. It could incentivize some people to take some risk and say maybe the FBI will get us our money back. The second is I haven't been in the middle of the space for as long as I have. I still think that everyone has a little bit of a responsibility here to help your neighbor out. To, if you hide an event from happening, how do you know that you don't have that key, that critical piece of information that could stop the next attack? So, I really do think that cybersecurity is a team sport. The more we understand about the threats that are coming in, the more that we can really equip our defenses, which really does go back to an earlier point, by the way. Cybersecurity is absolutely a team sport, but at the same time, you just want to be faster than the next guy that's getting chased by the bear. Ransomware actors, just like everyone else, they're rational actors. They're economic rational actors. They're going to use a technique until it doesn't work anymore. So you want to put yourself in that space where their techniques don't work on you anymore, that a phishing attack doesn't work, that a brute force attack doesn't work, that a wide open remote desktop protocol attack doesn't work anymore. Make yourself a harder target, and they're going to shift their focus from you. They're going to move away from you. They're going to go get somebody else. And it's just, I think we have to continue improving our defenses, and the bad guys are just going to move down the value chain on attacks.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's also that going back to the sharing piece, it's understanding how they're pivoting their attacks.
Yeah.
Because, go back 15, 20 years, talking about APT attacks and like, hey, these tactics are so very specific to this one actor group. And now, it's a commodity market. If you want to go buy a piece of malware, you can do that. So really understanding, hey, these are how those actor groups are evolving. I learned the most personally from that incident reporting, like the vendors who are transparent about this is how we were impacted. So I'm really big on making, even internally, we talk about how are we going to share this information outbound? How are we going to share it with our peers? But I do think it's, I have to say, I agree 100% that it is a team sport. I've not used the we need to run faster, but I like that. So I may use that this afternoon.
So here's a really, so I get a lot of questions about, what books are you reading? So I kind of have a go-to of 3 books. The first is, it's this one right here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's Active Measures by Thomas Rid. And it's more about Russian disinformation campaigns that operate using information from hack and leak campaigns. It's a really good 100-year plus look at how Russia has used information operations to great effect. The second book, and I don't have it here, but it's Ghost Fleet by Peter Singer. It's 2014, I think, but it does show how cyber can be a key part of geopolitical conflict, and that talks about a Russian and Chinese invasion or attack on the U.S. The third book, though, we're going way back. The Cuckoo's Egg. Okay. 1986, 1984. It's Cliff Stoll was a researcher at Cal Berkeley, and he found I'm not going to ruin the story for you, but he found an actor inside their network using some really interesting basic forensic techniques. But as you read the book, if you didn't know that it was happening when it was happening, some of the techniques the bad guys are using and some of the things that fail within defenses, it's the same thing over and over. So, what's old is new again, and some of the same things that we were seeing 20, 30, 40 years ago, we're still seeing in organizations. So there's so much room still for maturity, for improving our defenses, and you can just you can close out entire attack classes with some just solid basic security implementations.
Yeah, so I 100% agree. Curious, we had talked earlier about COVID and kind of, I very much view COVID. Some people went back to office. I know for our organization, we're largely come in a day or two a week. Some people are like, I happen to be fully remote, which being in Atlanta, very happy to not sit in the traffic. But how do you defenses to really protect against that threat actor? Because now I'm not in an office. Like the classic walls we've built have gone away. How do you think that changes the dynamic as we move forward with our security preparedness?
So I grew up in Atlanta, and so I know intimately of what you speak. I remember when Georgia 400 was built. So maybe
they're still working on it.
I know, right? Dating myself a little bit, I guess there, but so I mean, a lot of stuff changed a lot. I think a lot of organizations moved away at the right time, by the way, from VPN access back into the bricks and mortar. And we saw that shift over to software as a service and cloud-enabled access at CISA alone. So we're about 2,500 employees, I think, in March of 2020. I think we only had VPN licenses for probably about 1,500. So everyone moved out of the office almost overnight over the course of that weekend, Friday the 13th, March 2020, when all the schools, at least in the DC area and throughout the East Coast, shut down. And so we didn't have a stable ability to engage. And so then we all shifted to workplace as a service, right? Cloud-enabled access that allowed us to move away from VPNs, which at the time, by the way, had just been getting waxed by adversaries. We'd seen at that point known vulnerabilities getting exploited for solid year plus by the bad guys. So we're seeing this modernization in how we compute and how we're productive. A lot of it's cloud enabled. And so as I think about what are some of the big challenges that organizations are still struggling with, it's what sort of understanding and transparency do we have from our cloud partners? Do we understand what their security programs and protocols are, what their incident response processes look like? And again, this is why having a partner, whether it's an MSP or other, that is open, that has events like this, that really talks about what their incident response plans are, what their ability to manage and mitigate events looks like. It's critically important. The black box or approach, it doesn't instill and invoke build trust. And I think a more forward-leaning, engaging organization that you're putting a lot of, organizations are putting a lot of risk into the hands of third parties, whether it's to manage HR, payroll. It's crazy. We've really seen this streamlining of business functions. And if someone else can do it better and cheaper for us, then we're going to go do that. We're going to shift all that requirement over there. But remember, you're not shifting your risk. You still own that risk. That's still your PII or whatever the intellectual property or other sensitive information is. You're just making someone else, you're bringing someone else into the risk management paradigm. And again, do you understand what they're doing? And you've got to be able to engage them and ensure that you have a good understanding of what they're doing.
Yeah, I think the same holds true for everybody who moved to cloud. Like there was a big push, everybody needs to move to whether it be Azure, AWS, or anything else. And it's just somebody else's computer.
Right.
And not as much focus on how do you secure that. Do you see the cloud as being kind of, I get it for the SaaS services, like identity is the target, but do you think we're going to continue to see all those cloud providers remain as active targets for threat actors?
Oh, absolutely. And here's why. So there's an event in China called the Taifu Cup, and it's a hackers conference and competition where the Chinese governments and others put out pretty big bounties for certain classes of exploits and discovery of vulnerabilities. And time again, cloud, whether it's a Hyper-V escape or something like that, those rank at the top of the award categories. You know, here's the best way to think about it though. Every organization that I'm associated with has some either existing or increasing dependency on the cloud. An adversary sees that and sees attack surface.
Yep.
Everyone, you know, we're moving away from these exclusively on-premises environments. You know, Active Directory on, you know, Exchange, it's so hard to manage, and really that skill set is getting increasingly harder and harder to find as more people are working, you know, developing AWS and GCP and Azure competencies. You know, you're not seeing a lot of folks working, you know, taking the latest and greatest Exchange class. So we are seeing that that shift happen on the adversary side because we're creating additional dependencies and attack surface for them to go after. And then kind of the last point here is, you know, as I think about what the next several years look like, I already touched on it earlier, but, you know, just think about your workplace, your home, your cars, the things you're wearing, the things that may go in. You know, if Elon Musk gets his way, we're all going to have little Microsoft ports in the back of our head that we can take, which would kind of be cool, but at the same time, like really scary. But it's going to get that much more complicated from an attack surface perspective in the next several years. But don't think that like 5 years from now, it's all going to get miraculously easy. For the rest of human history, we will rely upon increasingly complicated and complex technologies, and there will always be those that seek to find the ability to exploit those technologies for their benefit. And you know, at first it'll just see if they could, and then it'll be because they could get money out of it, and then you'll see organizations, countries specifically, that do it for national security objectives. There's a great question in here about operational technologies and SCADA. So yeah, Roderick Frank asked about the SCADA vulnerabilities, and I'm seeing three trends out there from actors. First is that, and this is related to the cloud question, but we're seeing that the really sophisticated nation state actors are developing capabilities, and they have targeting lists that go after software supply chain issues. So they really want to be somewhere in that value chain, so they can have those breakout and one-to-many attacks. So the kind of knocking on the front door of a big bank or whatever, walking through. I think you'll see the lower sophistication actors continue to try to brute force access, but the more sophisticated actors are looking for the economies of scale. Everyone's going to look to be able to break into that supply chain so that they can get the one-to-many breakout attacks. The second thing we're seeing is continue to see ransomware. As long as bad guys can profit from cybercrime and there's no real penalties, it's going to be a really prolific business case. The third thing I am seeing is an increasing focus by the really sophisticated actors, Russia, China, Iran in particular, on destructive capabilities. And just last week, there was some reporting from the US government and from Mandiant and Dragos about a new malware framework that was targeting programmable logic controllers in operational technologies. And it just makes perfect sense to me. And by the way, there was also a report last summer by the FBI and CISA that talked about the Chinese developing some sort of campaign or destructive capability based on intrusions that were observed in 2013. So while it feels new, this has been around and a focus and a priority for governments for quite some time. But that's, look, I mean, and why are they doing this? You know, not everybody, as you're seeing in Russia right now, I think if you can avoid fighting a war with troops on the ground, that you know, national leadership will make those decisions and do whatever they can to avoid those kinetic conflicts. And one way to do it is you change the decision calculus of an adversary, of an opponent, by undermining essential services in their country and undermining the confidence and faith of the citizenry of, you know, for instance, us here. And that's part of what the government's worried about right now, US government, is if Russia would shut off a water supply in a major city like Atlanta for longer than 3, 4, 5 days, you would have unrest. You would have very public demonstrations against not just Russia, but also the ability of our state, local, federal leadership to be able to A, protect us, and B, deliver those essential services. So it's increasingly, I think, going to be just not just a technical attack capability, but it's going to be focused on psychological attacks through disruption of services.
Yeah, for sure. Cyber is the tip of the spear. That is where we're going.
I think so.
Jay just popped back on. Maybe he's tired of hearing us talk.
No, this is great. We've got like 4 minutes, so I'm glad Chris gave us those 3 pointers. But anything we could wrap up with, the people are still hanging tight. So this is awesome. Thank you.
So I guess Chris, first, thank you. This has been great. It did lots of wonderful information. I guess final question for me, if you could give some parting words, and you've given a lot of words already, so you're probably going to regurgitating some information you shared, but some parting words for MSPs on how do they help their customers to stay protected? We've talked a lot about working with a good MSP, but what can those MSPs do to ensure that they're protecting their customers? Because at the end of the day, their customers are those mom and pop shops, all the day-to-day businesses that make our economy what it is. Any parting advice for them?
Yeah, so this is the tricky part, right? Because MSPs, as soon as you reach out to your customers and you start talking about security risks, they may not care. They may not be thinking about that because they could be in a community that doesn't appear to be targeted by Russia or China. But this gets to that if you're touching the internet, you're on the playing field for cyber criminals. And so that ransomware design basis threat is a critical it's a critical thing to emphasize. And so what I would encourage you to do is engage as an MSP, engage your customers and tell them the things that you're doing to ensure that they're protected. Be transparent. Talk about the things that you do on a regular basis to understand how your systems are protected and how you're protecting your customers as well. The more you engage on this, but do it in a way that says you're being proactive. So don't just talk about how scary the world is. Talk to your people about the things you're doing to protect them. So it's not just the world's bad. Don't just admire the problem. It's the so what, but most importantly, what are you doing about it?
Yeah, totally. Quantify the risk. That's definitely great advice. Awesome. Jay, I know.
Yeah. So we just popped up a couple of polls, and folks are answering. So we thank both of you all, Chris and Dave. This was awesome. I took a lot of notes actually. So thank you guys. And then for everyone that attended, we really appreciate your time. A full hour webinar, which is amazing. We could keep going, right? But again, thank you, Chris. We really appreciate your time, and Dave, thank you for hosting. And everyone have a great day. If we didn't get to your questions, we'll actually email you back some of those answers. So thank you all.
Awesome. Thanks all.